Two countries, one island, completely opposite destinies. In 2025, while the Dominican Republic celebrates record tourism numbers and economic growth, Haiti has become something experts can only describe as a failed state. Gang violence controls 60% of the capital, and yet just across an invisible border, families vacation peacefully on pristine beaches. How is this even possible? The answer lies buried in decisions made centuries ago that continue to shape these nations today. Welcome to Geography by Jeff. And today we're uncovering the shocking reality of Hispaniola. But first, the numbers behind this impossible situation tell a story that seems almost too dramatic to believe. The numbers that tell the whole story. The Dominican Republic's GDP per capita sits at $11,300 in 2025, while Haiti struggles with just $1,800. That's a 6-to-1 difference between countries separated by nothing more than an imaginary line running through the middle of an island. The Global Peace Index ranks the Dominican Republic 72nd out of 163 countries for safety, placing it ahead of nations like Italy and South Korea. Haiti doesn't even make the list anymore because it's considered too dangerous to measure accurately. The Human Development Index tells the same story. The Dominican Republic ranks as a high human development country at 0.767, while Haiti sits at 0.535, placing it among the world's least developed nations. These numbers seem impossible when you consider the geography. Both countries experience the same Caribbean climate, face similar hurricane seasons, and share virtually identical natural resources. The Dominican Republic covers 48,671 square kilometers, while Haiti occupies 27,750 square kilometers of the same island. They share a 376-kilometer border that you can cross in minutes. Yet crossing that border means entering a completely different world. In 2025, the Dominican Republic welcomed over 10 million tourists who spent $8.5 billion, making tourism the country's largest industry. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department maintains a Level 4 travel advisory for Haiti. Do not travel under any circumstances. The economic gap has actually grown wider in recent years despite billions in international aid flowing to Haiti. Between 2010 and 2025, the Dominican Republic's economy expanded by an average of 5.2% annually, even weathering the global pandemic better than most Caribbean nations. Haiti's economy, by contrast, contracted by 1.8% annually over the same period. The Dominican peso has remained relatively stable against the US dollar, while the Haitian gourde has lost over 60% of its value since 2018. Inflation in Haiti reached 29% in 2024, compared to just 3.8% in the Dominican Republic. Infrastructure tells an even starker story. The Dominican Republic generates 4,000 megawatts of electricity and maintains 95% grid coverage across the country. Haiti produces barely 300 megawatts and struggles to provide power to even 40% of its population. Dominican roads connect every major city with modern highways, while Haiti's road network remains largely unpaved and impassable during rainy seasons. Internet penetration reaches 85% of Dominicans, but only 35% of Haitians have reliable access to online services. Education outcomes reveal the human cost of this divide. Dominican children attend school for an average of 14.2 years, with literacy rates above 95%. Haitian children average just 8.7 years of schooling, and nearly 40% of adults cannot read. The Dominican Republic has 47 universities serving its 11 million people, while Haiti has only 15 institutions for its 11.5 million citizens. These educational gaps create a cycle where Dominican workers can compete in global markets, while Haitian workers remain trapped in subsistence agriculture. Healthcare statistics paint an equally dramatic picture. Life expectancy in the Dominican Republic reaches 74 years, compared to just 64 years in Haiti. The Dominican Republic has 1.6 doctors per 1,000 people, while Haiti has only 0.23 doctors per 1,000 people. Infant mortality rates show 27 deaths per 1,000 births in Haiti versus 12 per 1,000 in the Dominican Republic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Dominican Republic managed to vaccinate 80% of its population, while Haiti achieved less than 2% vaccination coverage. Crime and security metrics reveal the most troubling disparities. Haiti recorded 1,380 kidnappings in 2024, making it one of the world's kidnapping capitals. The Dominican Republic reported fewer than 50 kidnappings in the same period. Homicide rates in Haiti exceed 40 per 100,000 people, placing it among the world's most violent countries. The Dominican Republic maintains a homicide rate of 12 per 100,000, which, while elevated, remains manageable for law enforcement. Gang violence affects daily life for most Haitians, while Dominican citizens enjoy relative security in their communities. Migration patterns reflect these harsh realities. Over 800,000 Haitians have fled to the Dominican Republic, creating a refugee population that represents nearly 8% of Haiti's total population. Another 200,000 Haitians live in the United States, with thousands more attempting dangerous sea crossings each year. Meanwhile, the Dominican Republic experiences immigration from other Caribbean nations seeking economic opportunities, reversing the traditional migration flow. International relationships demonstrate how differently the world treats these neighbors. The Dominican Republic maintains strong diplomatic ties with the United States, European Union, and regional partners. International investors view it as a stable democracy with predictable institutions. Haiti, conversely, has seen its diplomatic missions close in multiple countries due to inability to pay staff or maintain facilities. The United Nations has repeatedly intervened in Haitian affairs, while the Dominican Republic participates as an equal partner in international organizations. These measurements all point to the same conclusion. Two countries sharing identical geography have produced completely opposite outcomes. Climate cannot explain why one thrives while the other collapses. Natural resources cannot account for such dramatic differences in human development. Population density cannot justify why one maintains order while the other descends into chaos. The puzzle becomes even more intriguing when you consider that both countries faced similar challenges throughout history. Both experienced European colonization, slavery, dictatorship, natural disasters, and foreign interventions. Both started their independent existence as poor agricultural societies dependent on sugar production. Yet somehow, these shared experiences produced radically different institutional outcomes that persist today. What forces could be powerful enough to create such lasting differences between peoples living on the same piece of land? The answer requires understanding that visible borders often hide invisible foundations built centuries ago. Every statistic measuring Haiti's failure and the Dominican Republic's success today connects to decisions made by people who died long before either country gained independence. These historical choices created institutional patterns that continue replicating themselves generation after generation, producing the outcomes we measure in 2025. The mathematical precision of these differences suggests something systematic rather than random. Countries don't accidentally develop six-fold gaps in wealth or tenfold differences in security without underlying structural causes. The patterns are too consistent, the gaps too wide, and the persistence too long to result from recent policy mistakes or temporary setbacks. Understanding why requires traveling back to when European ships first appeared on the horizon and set in motion the chain of events that would determine the fate of millions of people who had not yet been born. Columbus's landing and the seeds of division. December 6, 1492 changed everything for the people living on an island they called Quisqueya. Christopher Columbus stepped onto the northwest coast of what we now call Haiti, becoming the first European to set foot on this Caribbean island. Columbus had been sailing for weeks searching for a route to Asia when he spotted land rising from the blue waters. His ships landed on a stretch of coastline that would later become Haitian territory, and in that moment, he claimed the entire island for the Spanish crown. This single act of claiming ownership over land already inhabited by hundreds of thousands of indigenous people would set in motion centuries of conflict and division. The Taino people who lived on Quisqueya had built sophisticated societies across the island over thousands of years. They grew crops, created art, and established complex political structures under chiefs called caciques. Spanish records from the period suggest the Taino population numbered between 400,000 to 1 million people when Columbus arrived. These indigenous communities had developed different regional variations across the island, with some areas more densely populated than others. The Taino in the western regions where Columbus first landed had established major settlements along the coast and inland valleys. The eastern parts of the island hosted other Taino communities with their own local leaders and customs. Spain's initial approach to colonizing Hispaniola focused on extracting gold and establishing a base for further exploration. Spanish colonists forced the Taino into brutal labor systems, primarily mining gold from the island's rivers and mountains. The Spanish established their first permanent settlement at La Novedad on the northern coast, then later moved their main operations to Santo Domingo on the southern shore. These early colonial efforts concentrated on the eastern and southern parts of the island, where Spanish administrators found it easier to control indigenous populations and extract resources. Spanish colonial authorities quickly realized that Hispaniola's gold deposits were limited compared to the vast riches being discovered on the American mainland. News of Aztec and Inca treasures reached Spanish officials in Santo Domingo, making their Caribbean island seem like a minor prize by comparison. Spain's colonial bureaucracy began treating Hispaniola as a secondary outpost, useful mainly for resupplying ships heading to more lucrative territories in Mexico and South America. The Spanish governor of Hispaniola received fewer resources, fewer colonists, and less attention from Madrid as Spain's focus shifted to continental conquests. This strategic neglect created significant consequences for Spanish control over the entire island. Spanish settlements remained concentrated in the eastern regions around Santo Domingo, while the western territories received minimal Spanish presence. The mountainous western coast where Columbus had first landed became increasingly isolated from Spanish administrative control. Spanish officials occasionally sent expeditions to the western regions, but they never established permanent settlements or maintained consistent authority over these territories. The sparse Spanish presence in western Hispaniola created opportunities for other European powers to establish footholds on the island. French pirates and buccaneers began using the western coasts as bases for attacking Spanish treasure fleets crossing the Caribbean. These French corsairs found the western harbors perfect for hiding their ships and repairing vessels between raids. The Spanish governors in Santo Domingo lacked sufficient military resources to patrol the entire island effectively, allowing French presence to grow unchallenged. French settlements in western Hispaniola began as temporary pirate bases, but gradually evolved into permanent agricultural colonies. French colonists discovered that the western regions possessed excellent soil for growing tobacco, a crop that commanded high prices in European markets. Unlike the Spanish focus on gold mining, French settlers developed plantation agriculture as their primary economic activity. They imported enslaved Africans to work tobacco fields and began establishing a completely different type of colonial economy. The contrast between Spanish and French colonial activities became more pronounced as decades passed. Spanish territories in the east maintained their focus on mining, trading, and serving as an administrative center for Spanish Caribbean operations. Spanish colonists established cattle ranches and sugar plantations, but these operations remained smaller and less intensive than French agricultural developments. The Spanish colonial economy depended more on trade connections with other Spanish territories than on intensive agricultural production. French colonial development in the West took a markedly different direction. French planters concentrated on maximizing agricultural output through intensive slave labor. They imported far more enslaved Africans than Spanish colonists and developed more systematic approaches to plantation management. French colonial authorities encouraged aggressive expansion of cultivated land, leading to more extensive deforestation and environmental changes in the western regions. Economic differences between the two sides of the island became increasingly apparent by the mid-1600s. French territories generated substantial profits from tobacco exports, attracting more French investment and immigration. Spanish territories continued to serve administrative functions but produced less agricultural wealth. The population composition also diverged, with French territories developing much larger enslaved populations relative to free colonists compared to Spanish areas. Cultural and social differences emerged alongside economic divergence. French colonists brought different legal traditions, religious practices, and social customs to their territories. Spanish colonists maintained their own distinct cultural patterns based on Spanish colonial norms. Language differences created additional barriers between the two populations, with French becoming the colonial language in the West and Spanish dominating in the East. By the 1680s, the informal division of Hispaniola between French and Spanish spheres of influence had become entrenched through decades of separate development. The western third of the island functioned as a French colony in all but official recognition, while the eastern two-thirds remained under Spanish control. Trade, population, agriculture, and governance had evolved along completely different paths in each region. What began as Columbus's unified claim to one island had evolved into two distinct colonial experiments with different economic systems, different social structures, and different relationships with their respective imperial centers. The stage was now set for European diplomats to formalize what had already become a practical reality through decades of separate development. The treaty that split an island forever. September 20, 1697, marked the moment when European diplomats, sitting in a castle in the Netherlands, decided the fate of millions of Caribbean people they would never meet. The Treaty of Ryswick officially ended the 9 Years' War between European powers, but buried within its diplomatic language was a clause that would echo through centuries. France received formal recognition of its claim to the western third of Hispaniola, while Spain retained the eastern two-thirds. European negotiators treated this territorial division as a minor detail in resolving their continental conflicts, never imagining they were creating the foundation for one of history's most dramatic tales of divergent national development. The treaty transformed what had been an informal arrangement into international law. French and Spanish officials had been operating separate colonial administrations on their respective sides of the island for decades, but the Treaty of Ryswick gave these arrangements legal permanence recognized by all major European powers. The boundary line drawn by diplomats in Europe would become an invisible barrier separating two completely different approaches to colonial development. France approached its newly recognized territory of Saint-Domingue with systematic intensity that Spanish officials in Santo Domingo could never match. French colonial planners viewed their Caribbean territories as profit-generating machines designed to extract maximum wealth for the French Empire. They developed detailed plans for converting every acre of suitable land into sugar plantations, importing whatever labor force necessary to achieve their economic goals. French investors poured capital into Saint-Domingue infrastructure, building ports, roads, and processing facilities specifically designed to support intensive agricultural operations. Spain's colonial philosophy in Santo Domingo operated on completely different principles. Spanish authorities treated their Caribbean possessions as strategic outposts supporting broader imperial objectives rather than standalone profit centers. Spanish colonial development followed patterns established across their American empire, emphasizing territorial control, religious conversion, and integration into existing Spanish trade networks. Spanish officials showed less interest in maximizing agricultural output than in maintaining stable administrative control over their territory. These different colonial approaches produced immediate changes in population composition and economic activity on both sides of the new border. France began importing enslaved Africans to Saint-Domingue at unprecedented rates, transforming the demographic structure of their territory within just a few decades. French plantation owners imported workers specifically chosen for their agricultural skills and physical capacity to survive brutal working conditions. The French colonial population grew to include only a small percentage of free Europeans managing enormous populations of enslaved workers. Spanish colonial demographics in Santo Domingo evolved along different lines. Spanish territories maintained more balanced populations between enslaved and free inhabitants, with significant numbers of mixed-race individuals occupying intermediate social positions. Spanish colonial law provided mechanisms for enslaved people to purchase their freedom, creating larger free black and mixed-race populations than existed in French territories. Spanish economic activities included cattle ranching, small-scale agriculture, and trade operations that required different types of labor arrangements than French plantation agriculture. Agricultural systems on each side of the border developed according to these different colonial priorities. French planters in Saint-Domingue focused intensively on sugar production, clearing vast areas of forest to plant sugarcane and constructing elaborate processing facilities to refine raw sugar for export to European markets. French agricultural techniques prioritized short-term profit maximization over environmental sustainability, leading to rapid soil depletion and extensive deforestation across much of their territory. Spanish agricultural development in Santo Domingo remained more diversified and less environmentally destructive. Spanish colonists raised cattle on natural grasslands, grew food crops for local consumption, and maintained smaller sugar operations alongside other economic activities. Spanish land use patterns preserved more of the original forest cover and maintained more sustainable relationships between agricultural production and environmental preservation. Legal frameworks established by the Treaty of Ryswick created institutional foundations that would persist long after colonial rule ended. French colonial law in Saint-Domingue developed around the Code Noir, a legal system specifically designed to regulate plantation slavery and maximize economic efficiency. These French legal traditions emphasized centralized authority, rigid social hierarchies, and economic regulations designed to serve imperial interests. Spanish colonial law in Santo Domingo followed different traditions based on centuries of Spanish imperial experience across the Americas. Spanish legal systems provided more complex social categories, recognized mixed-race populations, and established institutions like the Catholic Church that created alternative sources of authority beyond colonial administrators. Spanish colonial traditions included concepts of municipal governance and local participation that would influence post-independence political development. Economic relationships between the two territories and their respective imperial centers reinforced these institutional differences. Saint-Domingue became tightly integrated into French imperial trade networks, with nearly all agricultural output exported directly to France and most manufactured goods imported from French sources. This economic arrangement created enormous profits for French merchants and planters, but left Saint-Domingue completely dependent on external trade relationships. Santo Domingo maintained more diversified economic connections within the broader Spanish imperial system. Spanish territories traded with other Spanish Caribbean possessions, mainland Spanish colonies, and occasionally with non-Spanish partners through legal and illegal channels. This economic diversification provided more resilience against disruptions, but generated less intensive wealth accumulation than the French system. The Treaty of Ryswick had essentially created two separate experiments in colonial development operating under identical climate and geographic conditions. French Saint-Domingue represented intensive extractive colonialism designed to maximize short-term profits for European investors. Spanish Santo Domingo represented more traditional colonial patterns focused on territorial control and integration into broader imperial systems. By the late 1700s, these two experiments would produce such dramatically different outcomes that visitors crossing the border would find themselves entering completely different worlds. By the 1780s, the demographic contrasts between the two halves of Hispaniola revealed the stark differences in colonial philosophy. French Saint-Domingue housed roughly 25,000 French colonists who controlled an enslaved population of over 700,000 people. Spanish Santo Domingo maintained a population of about 38,000 Spanish citizens, alongside 38,000 free people of mixed race and fewer than 15,000 enslaved individuals. These numbers expose the fundamental difference between two colonial approaches. France had created a society where enslaved people outnumbered free inhabitants by nearly 15 to 1, while Spain had developed a more balanced population structure. The demographic imbalance in Saint-Domingue reflected France's ruthless focus on agricultural profit maximization. French plantation owners imported enslaved Africans at rates that defied human sustainability, viewing workers as replaceable machinery in their sugar-producing operations. Ships arrived constantly in French ports carrying new captives to replace those who died under brutal working conditions. French colonial records show that the average lifespan of an enslaved person on a Saint-Domingue plantation was just 7 years. This systematic dehumanization created a society built on the constant threat of violence and the perpetual importation of new workers. Spanish colonial demographics in Santo Domingo evolved through different priorities and legal frameworks. Spanish colonial law provided mechanisms for enslaved people to purchase their freedom through a system called coartation, which allowed individuals to pay for their liberty in installments. Spanish authorities also recognized children born to mixed unions and created legal categories for people of various racial backgrounds. These legal traditions produced a society with more social mobility and less rigid racial boundaries than existed in French territories. Economic output statistics from the 1780s demonstrate the staggering productivity of French Saint-Domingue compared to Spanish Santo Domingo. Saint-Domingue generated approximately 40% of all sugar consumed in Europe and produced more coffee than any other location in the world. The colony exported 163 million pounds of sugar annually, along with 68 million pounds of coffee, 1.5 million pounds of indigo, and substantial quantities of cotton and cacao. These exports generated enormous wealth for French merchants and investors, making Saint-Domingue the most profitable colony in the French Empire. French colonial administration operated Saint-Domingue as a highly efficient extraction machine designed to convert enslaved labor into European luxury goods. French planters invested heavily in sugar mills, processing equipment, and transportation infrastructure specifically designed to maximize agricultural output. They cleared enormous areas of forest to plant sugarcane, constructed elaborate irrigation systems to support intensive cultivation, and built sophisticated refineries to process raw sugar into finished products ready for European markets. Spanish Santo Domingo produced far less concentrated wealth than its French neighbor. Spanish colonists focused on cattle ranching, small-scale agriculture, and trade activities that generated steady but modest profits. Spanish territories exported some sugar, tobacco, and hides, but never achieved the industrial-scale production that characterized French operations. Spanish economic activities remained more diversified and less environmentally destructive, but this approach generated significantly less wealth per capita than French intensive agriculture. The social hierarchies that emerged in each territory reflected these different economic foundations. Saint-Domingue developed an extremely rigid three-tier social structure with white French colonists at the top, free people of color in the middle, and enslaved Africans at the bottom. Free people of color, known as affranchis, often achieved considerable wealth through business activities, but faced constant discrimination from white colonists who refused to accept them as social equals. Many affranchis owned enslaved people themselves and operated plantations using the same brutal methods employed by white owners. Spanish colonial society in Santo Domingo maintained more fluid social boundaries and provided greater opportunities for advancement between social categories. Spanish colonial law recognized numerous racial classifications and allowed for social mobility through various mechanisms including military service, church positions, and economic success. Spanish territories developed a more complex social structure with multiple intermediate categories between European and African ancestry, creating a society with more gradual social gradations rather than rigid barriers. Environmental consequences of these different colonial approaches became increasingly apparent by the late 1700s. Saint-Domingue had cleared roughly 80% of its original forest cover to create space for sugar plantations, leading to widespread soil erosion and environmental degradation. French intensive agriculture depleted soil nutrients rapidly, requiring constant expansion into new territories to maintain production levels. Santo Domingo retained much more of its original forest cover and maintained more sustainable agricultural practices that worked with natural ecosystems rather than completely replacing them. By 1800, these different colonial experiences had created two societies with fundamentally different capabilities, institutions, and social structures. Saint-Domingue possessed enormous wealth but depended completely on enslaved labor, external trade relationships, and environmental exploitation that could not continue indefinitely. Santo Domingo had developed more sustainable economic patterns, more flexible social institutions, and more resilient environmental relationships, but generated much less concentrated wealth. The tensions building within Saint-Domingue's brutal plantation system were becoming impossible to contain. The massive enslaved population had endured decades of systematic brutality while watching their labor generate unprecedented wealth for their oppressors. The rigid social hierarchies, the environmental destruction, and the complete dependence on forced labor had created a society balanced on the edge of collapse. Meanwhile, Santo Domingo's more balanced social structure and diversified economy had created different internal dynamics that would prove crucial when both territories faced the political upheavals that were about to transform the entire Caribbean world. Revolution, independence, and the price of freedom. August 22, 1791 forever changed the course of world history when enslaved people in Saint-Domingue launched what would become the only successful slave revolt in human history. The uprising began on plantations in the northern plains and spread rapidly across French colonial territory. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people had joined the rebellion, burning sugar plantations and killing their former masters. The revolt was led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved person who had taught himself to read and write, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who would eventually become Haiti's first emperor. By 1804, the rebels had defeated French colonial forces and declared independence as Haiti, creating the world's first nation founded by formerly enslaved people. The success of the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through every colonial power and slave-owning society in the Americas. European governments and the United States viewed Haiti's independence as an existential threat to their own colonial systems and slave-based economies. The mere existence of a successful slave rebellion challenged the fundamental assumptions that supported slavery and colonial rule across the Western Hemisphere. Plantation owners from Virginia to Brazil lived in constant fear that their own enslaved populations would follow Haiti's example. This fear translated into immediate and systematic international isolation of the new Haitian state. The United States refused to recognize Haiti's independence until 1862, nearly 60 years after the revolution succeeded. France demanded compensation for its lost colony before considering recognition. Britain maintained official neutrality, but secretly provided support to French attempts to reclaim their former territory. Spain, still controlling the eastern portion of Hispaniola, viewed Haitian independence as a threat to their own colonial possessions throughout the Caribbean. The economic consequences of this isolation proved devastating for Haiti's development prospects. International trade became nearly impossible when major powers refused to recognize Haitian sovereignty or establish diplomatic relations. European merchants avoided Haitian ports, fearing their governments would punish them for trading with the revolutionary state. American ships rarely visited Haiti despite the potential profits from trade, as Southern slaveholders pressured the U.S. government to maintain its embargo against the island nation. France demanded an indemnity of 150 million francs in exchange for recognizing Haiti's independence, a sum equivalent to roughly 10 times Haiti's annual revenue at the time. This debt was designed to compensate former French plantation owners for their lost property, including the monetary value of enslaved people who had freed themselves through revolution. French negotiators made clear that Haiti would face continued international isolation and possible military intervention if it refused to pay. Faced with these threats, Haitian leaders agreed to the indemnity in 1825, beginning a cycle of debt that would drain the country's resources for over a century. The French debt consumed enormous portions of Haiti's national budget for generations. Between 1825 and 1947, Haiti paid approximately $21 billion in today's currency to France and French banks. These payments prevented Haiti from investing in education, infrastructure, healthcare, or economic development. The debt forced Haiti to take out additional loans from French banks at high interest rates, creating a spiral of financial dependence that made economic growth nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the Dominican Republic followed a completely different path to independence that avoided the international hostility faced by Haiti. Dominican independence came through a revolt against Haitian rule in 1844, led by Juan Pablo Duarte and a secret society called La Trinitaria. The Dominican independence movement presented itself as a liberation from Haitian occupation rather than a challenge to slavery or colonial systems. This framing made Dominican independence far less threatening to established powers and slave-owning societies. The Dominican Republic never faced the systematic international isolation that crippled Haiti's early development. European powers and the United States viewed Dominican independence as a restoration of proper colonial order rather than a revolutionary threat. The Dominican Republic could establish trade relationships, seek international recognition, and access global financial markets without the barriers that confronted Haiti. These advantages allowed Dominican leaders to focus on building institutions and developing their economy rather than fighting for basic international legitimacy. Haiti's internal political development reflected the pressures created by international isolation and economic burden. The massive French debt created constant fiscal crises that destabilized Haitian governments and prevented long-term planning. Political leaders faced impossible choices between paying foreign creditors and meeting domestic needs. This financial pressure contributed to frequent coups and political instability as different factions competed for control over limited resources. Dominican political development occurred under very different circumstances. Dominican leaders could pursue normal diplomatic relationships with foreign powers and access international assistance for development projects. The absence of crippling foreign debt allowed Dominican governments to invest in infrastructure and institutions. Dominican political culture developed with less defensiveness toward foreign powers and more openness to international partnerships. The economic foundations established during these early independence years created lasting advantages for the Dominican Republic and disadvantages for Haiti. The Dominican Republic could develop its agricultural sector, establish trade relationships, and gradually build industrial capacity. Haiti remained trapped in a cycle where debt payments prevented investment in productive capacity, ensuring continued poverty and dependence on foreign creditors. Educational development reflected these different circumstances. The Dominican Republic could establish schools and universities with resources that Haiti had to send to French banks. Dominican literacy rates began climbing in the 1800s, while Haiti struggled to provide basic education. These educational gaps created different capabilities for economic development and political participation in each country. The contrasting experiences of gaining independence set Haiti and the Dominican Republic on trajectories that would diverge dramatically over time. Haiti's revolutionary path brought freedom, but at the cost of international isolation and crushing debt that prevented normal development. The Dominican Republic's more conventional independence allowed access to international markets and partnerships that supported gradual development. Yet even these profound historical differences cannot fully explain why two countries sharing identical climate and natural resources would develop such dramatically different outcomes. The answer requires examining forces that most people never consider when comparing nations. Geography's hidden role in national destiny. Physical geography creates invisible forces that shape national destinies in ways that most people never recognize. The Dominican Republic receives abundant rainfall from easterly trade winds that carry moisture from the Atlantic Ocean, creating lush tropical forests and fertile agricultural valleys. Haiti sits in the rain shadow created by the island's central mountain ranges, receiving significantly less precipitation and experiencing much drier conditions that make agriculture more challenging and forest regeneration nearly impossible. The Cordillera Central Mountain Range acts as a massive natural barrier that intercepts moisture-laden clouds before they can reach Haiti's western territories. When Atlantic trade winds encounter these mountains, they rise and cool, releasing their moisture on the eastern slopes in the form of rain that nourishes Dominican forests and farmland. By the time these air masses cross the mountain peaks and descend into Haitian territory, they have lost most of their moisture content, creating arid conditions that support only drought-resistant vegetation. This rain shadow effect means the Dominican Republic receives an average of 1,500 millimeters of rainfall annually, while many regions of Haiti receive less than 800 millimeters per year. The difference becomes even more pronounced during dry seasons, when Dominican rivers continue flowing from mountain watersheds, while Haitian streams often disappear completely. These contrasting precipitation patterns created fundamentally different environmental foundations that would interact with human activities in ways that amplified the effects of colonial and post-colonial policy decisions. French colonial policies in Haiti exploited the naturally drier environment in ways that created permanent environmental damage. During the colonial period, French authorities implemented massive deforestation programs specifically designed to ship lumber back to France for use in construction and shipbuilding. The systematic removal of forest cover might have been sustainable in the wetter climate of the Dominican Republic, where forests can regenerate relatively quickly, but Haiti's drier conditions made forest recovery extremely difficult once the original tree cover was removed. The deforestation crisis in Haiti became a self-reinforcing cycle that continues today. Without trees to hold soil in place during the rainy season, Haiti experiences severe erosion that washes away topsoil and reduces agricultural productivity. Farmers facing declining crop yields clear more marginal land for cultivation, leading to additional deforestation and further soil loss. The lack of trees also reduces the land's ability to retain moisture during dry periods, making drought conditions more severe and persistent. Today, Haiti has lost approximately 98% of its original forest cover, while the Dominican Republic maintains roughly 40% of its natural forests. Dominican environmental policies have focused on preserving watersheds and maintaining forest reserves that support both tourism and sustainable agriculture. The contrast becomes visible from space, where satellite images show the border between the two countries as a stark line separating green Dominican forests from brown Haitian landscapes. The Dominican Republic has successfully leveraged its environmental advantages to develop a thriving tourism industry that generates over $8 billion annually. Tourists visit Dominican beaches, mountain forests, and nature reserves that showcase the country's preserved natural beauty. Dominican authorities recognized that environmental preservation creates economic value and have implemented policies that balance development with conservation. This approach has attracted international investment and created jobs across multiple sectors of the economy. Haiti's environmental degradation has eliminated similar tourism opportunities and forced the population to depend on subsistence agriculture on increasingly degraded land. The lack of forests means Haiti cannot offer the scenic attractions that draw visitors to the Dominican Republic. Environmental destruction has also reduced the country's resilience to natural disasters, as deforested slopes provide no protection against flooding and landslides during hurricanes. Seismic activity adds another layer of geographic disadvantage that disproportionately affects Haiti's development. The Inequality fault system runs directly through Haiti's most populated areas, including the capital Port-au-Prince. This active fault line has generated numerous devastating earthquakes throughout Haiti's history, including the catastrophic 2010 earthquake that killed over 200,000 people and destroyed much of the country's already limited infrastructure. The 2021 earthquake struck Haiti's southern peninsula, causing additional destruction and displacement. The Dominican Republic faces seismic risks from its own fault systems, but these geological features run through less populated mountainous regions where earthquake damage affects fewer people and less critical infrastructure. Dominican building codes and emergency preparedness systems have also evolved to better withstand seismic events, reducing the human and economic costs of earthquakes. The difference in earthquake impacts reflects not only geographic factors, but also the institutional capacity to prepare for and respond to natural disasters. Environmental challenges combine with weak institutions to create compounding problems that trap Haiti in cycles of poverty and instability. When earthquakes destroy schools, hospitals, and government buildings, Haiti lacks the institutional capacity and financial resources to rebuild effectively. International aid often disappears into corrupt networks rather than reaching reconstruction projects. The combination of environmental vulnerability and institutional weakness means that each natural disaster sets Haiti further behind rather than providing opportunities for better reconstruction. Water resources illustrate how geography and institutions interact to create different outcomes. The Dominican Republic has invested in hydroelectric projects that harness mountain rivers to generate clean electricity for urban areas and tourist resorts. Dominican water management systems provide reliable access to clean water for most of the population. Haiti's degraded watersheds cannot support similar hydroelectric development, and the country struggles to provide basic water services to its population. Agricultural productivity reflects these environmental realities in measurable ways. Dominican farmers can grow diverse crops year-round thanks to reliable rainfall and preserved soil fertility. Haitian farmers struggle with drought, soil depletion, and limited access to irrigation systems. These agricultural differences affect food security, rural employment, and export earnings in both countries. Geographic factors created the stage upon which human decisions would play out, but the dramatic differences between Haiti and the Dominican Republic required more than environmental advantages and disadvantages to fully explain. The 20th century would bring a series of political upheavals, foreign interventions, and institutional changes that would determine which country could overcome its challenges and which would remain trapped by them. The 20th century brought a series of political upheavals that would determine which nation could build functional institutions and which would remain trapped in cycles of dysfunction. While Haiti and the Dominican Republic had already diverged significantly by 1900, the next 100 years would accelerate their separation through interventions, dictatorships, and policy decisions that pushed one country toward collapse while allowing the other to establish foundations for future prosperity. American Marines landed in Haiti in July 1915, beginning a 19-year occupation that fundamentally altered the country's political development. The United States justified this intervention by claiming Haiti needed protection from European creditors and political stability, but American officials primarily wanted to secure Haiti's strategic location and protect American business investments. The occupation created a military administration that bypassed existing Haitian institutions and imposed American-style governance systems that never took root in Haitian society. The American occupation involved forced labor programs that required Haitian peasants to build roads and infrastructure projects without compensation. These corvée labor systems resembled the colonial plantation arrangements that Haitians had fought to abolish during their revolution. American Marines suppressed resistance brutally, killing thousands of Haitians who opposed the occupation. The psychological impact of seeing foreign soldiers control their country created deep resentment that would influence Haitian attitudes toward international intervention for generations. American administrators in Haiti focused on collecting customs revenues and repaying foreign debts rather than building sustainable institutions. They established centralized control systems that concentrated power in Port-au-Prince while weakening local governance structures. When American forces finally withdrew in 1934, they left behind a political system designed to serve foreign creditors rather than Haitian citizens. The institutional framework created during the occupation would prove unable to handle the challenges of independent governance. The Dominican Republic experienced American intervention differently, though U.S. Marines also occupied Dominican territory from 1916 to 1924. American administrators in the Dominican Republic focused more on building infrastructure and establishing financial systems that would support long-term economic development. Dominican political leaders maintained more autonomy during the occupation and could negotiate with American officials from positions of greater strength. When the occupation ended, the Dominican Republic retained more functional institutions and better relationships with American business interests. Rafael Trujillo seized power in the Dominican Republic in 1930, establishing a dictatorship that would last 31 years until his assassination in 1961. Trujillo created a police state that controlled every aspect of Dominican life, but his regime also invested heavily in infrastructure development, education, and economic modernization. Trujillo built roads, schools, hospitals, and government buildings that provided foundations for future development. His economic policies diversified Dominican agriculture and attracted foreign investment in manufacturing industries. The Trujillo dictatorship committed horrific human rights abuses, including the 1937 massacre of thousands of Haitian migrants living in the Dominican Republic. Trujillo's security forces tortured and killed political opponents, while his regime looted millions of dollars from the national treasury. However, the institutional structures that Trujillo built to control Dominican society could be adapted for democratic governance after his death. The Dominican Republic emerged from dictatorship with functioning government agencies, educated bureaucrats, and economic infrastructure that supported continued development. Haiti followed a different trajectory when François Duvalier, known as Papa Doc, became president in 1957. Duvalier established a dictatorship that systematically destroyed Haitian institutions rather than building them. He created the Tonton Macoutes, a paramilitary force that terrorized the population and eliminated potential rivals. Duvalier deliberately weakened the Haitian military, government bureaucracy, and civil society organizations to prevent challenges to his rule. The Duvalier regime actively discouraged education and intellectual development among ordinary Haitians. Papa Doc viewed educated citizens as threats to his power and implemented policies that kept the population illiterate and dependent. When Duvalier died in 1971, his son Jean-Claude Duvalier continued these destructive policies until his overthrow in 1986. The 29-year Duvalier era left Haiti with virtually no functioning institutions and a traumatized population suspicious of government authority. Cold War politics influenced how the United States and other powers supported these Caribbean dictatorships. American officials viewed Trujillo as a reliable anti-communist ally despite his human rights record. The Dominican Republic received military aid, development assistance, and favorable trade relationships because it aligned with American strategic interests. The United States initially supported Papa Doc Duvalier because he opposed communist influence in Haiti, but his erratic behavior and extreme brutality made him an unreliable ally. American aid to Haiti remained limited and poorly coordinated, failing to build the institutional capacity that might have supported democratic transition. Economic policies during this period created lasting differences in each country's development trajectory. The Dominican Republic pursued import substitution industrialization that created manufacturing jobs and reduced dependence on agricultural exports. Dominican governments attracted foreign investment by providing political stability and infrastructure development. Tourism began emerging as a significant economic sector as international visitors discovered Dominican beaches and cultural attractions. Haiti's economy stagnated under policies designed to benefit the Duvalier family and their associates rather than promote national development. The regime taxed agricultural production heavily while providing few services to rural communities. The institutional legacies of these different 20th-century experiences became apparent when both countries attempted democratic transitions. The Dominican Republic successfully transitioned to civilian rule after Trujillo's assassination, holding competitive elections and establishing constitutional government. Dominican political parties, civil society organizations, and government agencies could function effectively because they had maintained some autonomy even under dictatorship. Haiti's transition from Duvalier rule proved far more difficult because the regime had systematically destroyed institutional capacity. By 2000, the foundations for today's dramatic differences between Haiti and the Dominican Republic had been established through a century of divergent political development. These institutional differences would determine how each country responded when natural disasters tested the strength of their social foundations. Natural disasters and human failures. January 12, 2010, at 4:53 p.m. local time, exposed the true cost of Haiti's institutional failures when a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck just 16 miles from Port-au-Prince. The ground shook for less than a minute, but that brief moment revealed decades of corruption and negligence that had left Haiti completely unprepared for natural disasters. Over 300,000 people died in the collapse of buildings constructed without proper engineering standards or government oversight. The presidential palace crumbled, the cathedral collapsed, and entire neighborhoods disappeared under piles of concrete and steel. What made this earthquake so devastating was not just its proximity to the capital, but Haiti's complete lack of building codes, emergency response systems, or disaster preparedness protocols. The earthquake revealed institutional weakness in ways that statistics could never capture. Hospitals collapsed while patients were still inside, trapping doctors and nurses under rubble. Schools pancaked on top of students who had been attending afternoon classes. Government buildings that should have coordinated rescue efforts were destroyed, leaving officials with no way to communicate or organize relief operations. The National Police Force lost its headquarters and most of its equipment, creating a security vacuum that would persist for years. Even the main port suffered severe damage, making it nearly impossible to bring in emergency supplies and reconstruction materials. International donors responded with unprecedented generosity, pledging over $13 billion for Haiti's reconstruction. The United States alone committed $4 billion in aid, while the European Union, Canada, and other nations contributed billions more. The Clinton Foundation raised hundreds of millions of additional dollars from private donors around the world. On paper, Haiti received more reconstruction aid per capita than any country in modern history. International conferences brought together world leaders who promised to build back better and transform Haiti into a more resilient nation. The reality of how this aid money was spent tells a different story entirely. Billions of dollars disappeared into administrative costs, consultant fees, and overhead expenses that never reached Haitian communities. International organizations spent enormous sums on their own operations, including luxury hotels for foreign staff and expensive vehicles that were later shipped to other countries when projects ended. The Red Cross alone raised $500 million for Haiti, but built only 6 permanent homes despite promising to construct entire neighborhoods. Much of the money went to foreign contractors who brought their own workers rather than hiring Haitians, meaning reconstruction efforts created few local jobs. Corruption within the Haitian government diverted additional billions from their intended purposes. Officials created fake reconstruction projects, and submitted fraudulent invoices to international donors. Government contracts went to companies owned by politicians' relatives rather than qualified construction firms. Building materials purchased with aid money were sold on black markets instead of being used for reconstruction. The lack of oversight meant that money intended to build earthquake-resistant housing often funded luxury mansions for corrupt officials instead. The Dominican Republic has faced similar natural disasters, but managed them with dramatically different results. When Hurricane George struck both countries in 1998, Dominican authorities coordinated effective evacuation procedures that saved thousands of lives, while Haitian officials failed to warn their population about the approaching storm. The Dominican Republic has implemented building codes that require earthquake-resistant construction techniques, while Haiti continues to allow construction without any engineering standards. Dominican emergency response systems can mobilize quickly when disasters strike, while Haiti often takes days or weeks to assess damage and coordinate relief efforts. Dominican disaster recovery demonstrates the importance of functional institutions and long-term planning. After major hurricanes, Dominican construction crews begin repairs immediately using stockpiled materials and established procedures. Insurance systems help businesses and homeowners rebuild quickly rather than waiting for international aid. The Dominican government maintains emergency funds that can finance immediate relief efforts without depending on foreign donors. These institutional advantages mean that natural disasters cause temporary setbacks rather than permanent developmental reversals. The assassination of President Jovenel Moïse on July 7, 2021, pushed Haiti over the edge into complete state failure. Gunmen broke into the presidential residence in Port-au-Prince and killed Moïse while he slept, creating a power vacuum that has never been filled. The assassination occurred just as Haiti was beginning to recover from years of political protests and economic decline. No clear succession plan existed, and different political factions claimed authority over the government. The interim prime minister lacked popular legitimacy, while the opposition refused to recognize his authority. Just 1 month after the presidential assassination, another devastating earthquake struck Haiti's southern peninsula on August 14, 2021. This 7.2 magnitude earthquake killed over 2,200 people and destroyed thousands of buildings in rural areas that lacked any emergency services. The combination of political chaos and natural disaster created conditions that overwhelmed Haiti's remaining governmental capacity. Relief efforts were hampered by gang violence that prevented aid organizations from reaching affected communities. The government that should have coordinated disaster response had essentially ceased to function. The perfect storm of political instability and natural disasters created a feedback loop that accelerated Haiti's descent into chaos. Gang violence increased dramatically after the presidential assassination as armed groups seized control of territory previously controlled by government forces. These gangs began kidnapping aid workers and blocking roads used to transport relief supplies, making disaster recovery nearly impossible. International organizations evacuated their staff rather than risk attacks, leaving Haitian communities to cope with earthquake damage on their own. Haiti's experience suggests that disasters reveal the true strength or weakness of a society's foundations, rather than creating new problems. Countries with strong institutions can absorb disaster impacts and rebuild effectively, while countries with weak institutions spiral into deeper crisis when disasters strike. The 2010 earthquake did not cause Haiti's institutional weakness. It simply exposed problems that had been building for decades through poor governance and systematic corruption. By 2025, these accumulated failures had created conditions where traditional government authority had virtually disappeared from large portions of the country, replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Gang rule and state collapse in 2025. Armed gangs now control approximately 85% of Port-au-Prince and its metropolitan area, transforming Haiti into what experts can only describe as a textbook failed state. The G9 alliance, led by former police officer Jimmy Barbecue Cherizia, coordinates multiple gang factions that have divided the capital into territories controlled by different armed groups. The 400 Mawozo gang controls areas east of the capital, while Village de Dieu and other groups dominate western neighborhoods. These gangs have expanded far beyond traditional slum areas to control middle-class neighborhoods, government buildings, and critical infrastructure, including the main port and fuel terminals. The speed of Haiti's descent into complete anarchy has shocked international observers who watched a struggling democracy collapse into chaos within just a few years. In 2020, Haiti still maintains some semblance of government authority despite widespread protests and political instability. The 2021 presidential assassination created a power vacuum that gangs quickly filled, but even then, some areas of the capital remained under government control. By 2024, armed groups had seized control of most of Port-au-Prince and begun expanding into rural areas that had previously remained peaceful. Gang territories operate like independent fiefdoms with their own rules, taxation systems, and security forces. The Wharf Jeremy gang controls the Site Soleil area, one of the largest slums in the Western Hemisphere, where gang leaders orchestrated a massacre in December 2024 that killed at least 207 people. The T. Mokok gang dominates the Delmas area, while the 5 Second gang controls parts of downtown Port-au-Prince. Each group maintains checkpoints on roads entering their territory, collecting taxes from anyone seeking passage, and controlling the movement of goods and people. These armed groups have essentially replaced government authority in areas under their control. Gang leaders settle disputes between residents, authorize business operations, and provide security services that the Haitian state cannot deliver. Some gangs have established informal courts where they adjudicate conflicts and impose punishments according to their own interpretations of justice. They collect fees for basic services like garbage collection and road maintenance that municipal governments can no longer provide. The humanitarian crisis created by gang rule affects every aspect of daily life for ordinary Haitians. Over 1 million people have been internally displaced by violence, including 700,000 children who have fled their homes seeking safety. The UN Human Rights Office verified that at least 5,601 people were killed due to gang violence in 2024, representing an increase of over 1,000 deaths from the previous year. Sexual violence has escalated dramatically, with survivors having severely limited access to protection and care services. Essential services have collapsed throughout areas under gang control. Hospitals struggle to operate when staff cannot safely travel to work and medical supplies cannot be delivered through gang-controlled checkpoints. Schools have closed indefinitely in most neighborhoods, leaving hundreds of thousands of children without access to education. Water and electricity services function sporadically when gang conflicts damage infrastructure, or armed groups deliberately cut off utilities to pressure rival factions. The international community has struggled to develop effective responses to Haiti's complete state collapse. The Multinational Security Support Mission, authorized by the United Nations and led by Kenya, has faced significant financial and logistical challenges that have prevented effective deployment. The mission received authorization to deploy 2,500 international police officers to support Haitian authorities, but funding shortfalls and security concerns have limited actual deployment to fewer than 400 officers by late 2024. Gang rule operates through different mechanisms than traditional government authority. Instead of bureaucratic procedures and legal frameworks, armed groups maintain control through violence and personal relationships. Gang leaders make decisions based on immediate tactical considerations rather than long-term policy planning. This approach creates unpredictable governance that changes rapidly as different factions gain or lose power through armed conflicts. Economic activities that sustain gang power include control over ports where they tax imported goods, fuel terminals where they regulate gasoline distribution, and drug trafficking routes that connect South American producers with North American markets. Armed groups also engage in kidnapping for ransom, extortion of businesses, and human trafficking operations that generate millions of dollars in revenue. These illegal activities provide more reliable income than the legitimate economy, which has contracted dramatically under gang rule. Children represent the most vulnerable population under gang rule, with rising hunger and severe poverty forcing hundreds, possibly thousands, to join criminal groups where they face abuse and exploitation. Girls experience labor and sexual exploitation, while boys are recruited as fighters and lookouts. The collapse of educational systems means an entire generation is growing up without formal schooling or legitimate economic opportunities. Migration patterns reveal how state collapse affects population movements both within Haiti and internationally. Thousands of Haitians attempt dangerous sea crossings to reach the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, or the United States each month. Those who cannot afford to leave the country migrate internally, crowding into the few remaining areas where government forces maintain some security presence. Haiti's 2025 reality represents the culmination of centuries of accumulated disadvantages that created conditions for complete state failure. The French indemnity that drained resources for over a century, American occupations that weakened institutions, Duvalier dictatorships that destroyed civil society, natural disasters that overwhelmed government capacity, and international aid programs that created dependency rather than building local capabilities all contributed to the institutional weakness that made gang takeover possible. Yet just across an invisible border, a completely different story has unfolded on the same island under virtually identical geographic conditions. While Haiti descended into chaos, its neighbor managed to build something entirely different. All odds. The Dominican Republic has transformed itself into one of Latin America's most remarkable success stories, achieving middle-income status with a GDP per capita that reached $11,300 in 2025. This Caribbean nation now welcomes over 10 million tourists annually, who contribute $8.5 billion to the economy, making tourism the country's largest industry. The Dominican Republic maintains political stability that has allowed for consistent economic growth, averaging 5.2% annually over the past 15 years, even weathering global economic downturns better than most regional neighbors. International credit rating agencies classify the Dominican Republic as investment grade, a status that attracts foreign investment and keeps borrowing costs manageable for government development projects. What makes this success particularly striking is that the Dominican Republic started from similar disadvantages as Haiti just decades ago. Both countries faced colonial exploitation, dictatorships, foreign interventions, and natural disasters that could have derailed development permanently. The Dominican Republic experienced its own brutal dictatorship under Rafael Trujillo, suffered through American occupation, and endured the same hurricanes and earthquakes that devastated Haiti. Yet somehow these shared challenges produced completely different outcomes on each side of the border. The Dominican Republic's transformation began with strategic policy choices made during the 1960s and 1970s that prioritized institutional development over short-term political gains. Dominican leaders invested heavily in education, creating a literacy rate that now exceeds 95% and establishing 47 universities that serve the country's 11 million residents. The government maintained consistent spending on infrastructure development, building modern highways that connect every major city and establishing reliable electricity generation that provides 95% grid coverage across the country. These investments created foundations for sustained economic growth, rather than the boom-bust cycles that characterize many developing economies. Tourism development showcases how the Dominican Republic leveraged its geographic advantages through smart policy decisions and long-term planning. The government recognized early that the country's beaches, mountains, and preserved forests could attract international visitors seeking tropical destinations. Dominican authorities implemented environmental protection policies that maintained 40% forest coverage while developing tourism infrastructure in designated zones. This approach preserved natural attractions while creating jobs in hospitality, transportation, and related service industries that now employ hundreds of thousands of Dominicans. The tourism industry's growth required significant infrastructure investments that benefited the entire economy. The Dominican Republic built modern airports in Santiago, Puerto Plata, and Punta Cana that can handle millions of international passengers annually. The government constructed highway networks that connect tourist destinations with urban centers, making it easier for visitors to explore different regions of the country. Port facilities were upgraded to accommodate cruise ships that bring additional tourists who spend money in local communities throughout their visits. Political stability has proven essential for sustaining economic development over multiple decades. The Dominican Republic successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy in the 1960s and has maintained competitive elections and peaceful transfers of power ever since. Dominican political parties have generally avoided the extreme polarization that paralyzes governance in many countries. This political stability allows for consistent policy implementation across different administrations, enabling long-term development projects to continue regardless of which party controls the government. Rule of law and effective governance systems distinguish the Dominican Republic from many regional neighbors. Dominican courts function with reasonable independence and predictability, giving businesses confidence to make long-term investments. Government agencies can implement policies effectively and provide services that citizens and businesses need to thrive. Corruption exists but remains at manageable levels that do not cripple government effectiveness or deter foreign investment. The Dominican Republic ranks significantly higher than regional averages on international governance indicators measured by organizations like the World Bank and Transparency International. Economic diversification has reduced Dominican dependence on any single industry or export market. While tourism generates the largest revenues, the Dominican Republic also developed manufacturing industries that produce textiles, pharmaceuticals, and electronic components for export markets. Agricultural production includes traditional crops like sugar and coffee, alongside newer products like avocados and organic cacao that command premium prices in international markets. This economic diversity provides resilience against external shocks that might devastate countries dependent on single industries. The Dominican Republic's approach to international relationships has created partnerships that support continued development. The country maintains strong diplomatic ties with the United States, European Union, and regional organizations that provide access to markets, investment, and technical assistance. Dominican leaders have pursued pragmatic foreign policies that avoid ideological conflicts while securing concrete benefits for national development. Trade agreements with major partners have opened markets for Dominican exports while attracting foreign companies that create jobs and transfer technology. Managing regional challenges demonstrates the Dominican Republic's institutional capacity and strategic thinking. The country hosts over 800,000 Haitian refugees while maintaining border security and preventing the instability affecting Haiti from spreading into Dominican territory. Dominican authorities have implemented immigration policies that provide humanitarian assistance while protecting national interests. The government coordinates with international organizations to manage refugee populations without allowing the crisis to overwhelm Dominican institutions or social services. The Dominican Republic's success was not inevitable and required specific choices made by leaders who prioritized long-term development over short-term political gains. Many countries with similar starting conditions have failed to achieve comparable results because they made different policy choices or lacked the institutional capacity to implement development strategies effectively. Dominican success resulted from consistent investments in human capital, infrastructure, and institutional development sustained over multiple decades. What makes the Dominican Republic's achievement particularly remarkable is how it occurred alongside Haiti's collapse on the same island. The contrast demonstrates that institutional quality and policy choices matter more than geographic or historical determinism in shaping national outcomes. The Dominican Republic's transformation from a poor agricultural economy to a middle-income democracy shows that countries can change their trajectories through sustained effort and effective governance. This tale of two nations sharing identical geography but achieving opposite destinies reveals something profound about how historical decisions create lasting consequences that extend far beyond the lifetimes of those who made them. The island of Hispaniola stands as one of history's most striking examples of how colonial systems, institutional development, and policy choices create dramatically different national trajectories. The Dominican Republic's economy now measures 10 times larger than Haiti's, while Haiti's crime index reaches 78.9 compared to the Dominican Republic's 60.57. These stark contrasts reflect the compounding effects of decisions made centuries ago, from the Treaty of Ryswick's territorial division to the French indemnity that crippled Haiti's development, to the institutional choices each nation made after independence. Geography cannot explain why two countries sharing identical climate and resources achieved such opposite outcomes. Instead, the divergent paths reveal how historical foundations determine present possibilities. Understanding this island teaches us how history's shadows shape our world today. If you enjoyed exploring this remarkable story of two nations, subscribe for more deep dive content examining how geography and history intersect to create our modern world.